This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Hello, everyone. You caught me mid-puff, as many people are wont to do. Quick little camera adjustment there. Let's go down there like that. That's much better. You need to see me, not the rest of me. Oh, I forgot to shut off the heat. There we go. It's a little chilly. It was a little chilly when I started the day today. Oh, this shirt's a little bit more stained than I thought it was. Oh, well, I like the color anyway. I'm a big fan of blue as a fashion statement for myself. Big fan of blue, love blue, I'm all about it, all this type of thing. So much is happening today. Lot is going on. So, let me introduce myself. If this is your first time here, my name is Cameron Lee Cowan. I am the Cameron Journal as such, and this is our weekly news show where we have hair sticking out of our headphones, and would you believe that I prepared? Where we talk about interesting things and interesting people and all this type of thing. Today we have an interview on the podcast from an author named Michael Sinclair, who does 1930s noir mysteries set in upstate New York. And he's done a lot of work, and it's very realistic, and it's really cool. So that was the interview for this week. In addition to weekly interviews, this is the Newshour. And what I do is I pull some headlines together, and I talk to people about them, and we kind of have a conversation about what's going on in the world. If you want to be part of the conversation, you can comment on the live. You can get at me on social media. I try to reply to everyone. Very important. Yeah, so that's kind of what we do here. It's very exciting. This is one of my favorite things to do. One of my favorite podcast segments to do, and I'm just very excited because we have so much going on. But I want to open with obviously today's tragedy in Nashville at Covenant Presbyterian Church and the Covenant School. There's already a little bit of controversy because the police had reported that the shooter was a woman named Audrey Hale, and they're actually trans, and we have this afternoon been misgendering and dead naming them. So in fact, I have some tweets here. The USA Today reported that police on Monday afternoon said that the shooter was a transgender man. Officials had initially misidentified the gender of the shooter. So I thought that was interesting. Just from it kind of breaks the pattern of what we normally associate with these sorts of school-based crimes. It says here that 3 children and 3 adults are dead after the 28-year-old trans man opened fire inside a Nashville private school. The attack marks the 129th mass shooting in the U.S. in 2023. Authorities believe the gunman, identified as this person's dead name, per NBC News, was at one point at the Covenant School, a private Christian institution that teaches preschool through 6th grade, though they were not able to say when. The perpetrator entered the building through a side door and was carrying 2 assault-style rifles and a handgun. Law enforcement heard shots coming from the 2nd level. They went to the gunfire. When the officers got to the 2nd floor, they saw a shooter who was firing. The officers engaged them. They were fatally shot by responding police officers. Spokesperson Don Aaron told the reporters. How Hale was able to enter the school in the first place is still under investigation, according to Metropolitan Nashville Police Chief John Drake. President Biden described the incident as heartbreaking and a family's worst nightmare and called on Congress to pass the assault weapons ban. It's about time we make some more progress, he said. And Tennessee Governor Bill Lee said he's closely monitoring the tragic situation and asked onlookers and bystanders to join us in praying for the school, congregation, and Nashville community. So, there's not a whole lot more to say about that other than what I always say during these situations. I think one of the biggest mistakes the Bush administration ever made was letting the assault weapons ban expire. And I think these conversations and these shootings and whatnot would be very different if that hadn't happened. So I'm all about, that's my phone. I'm all about, working on creating more and better gun control, but sensible gun control. I think there's a lot of things that are very tawdry about that narrative, and this type of thing is sure to bring back up those conversations again, and I don't necessarily think that that is helpful or productive. I think we have to have a good idea of what's going to work, what's actionable, and how to address this. And I think first and foremostly is that we need to work on our mental health facilities for people and work with people to provide them resources to channel these angry and violent feelings in another different direction. Some of that can be public, some of that can be faith-based, some of that can be community-based, but whatever it is, we need to explore all of those options in order to really start to begin to address this problem at a fundamental level. And it's quite tragic. It's another, as the article pointed out, 129 incidences have already occurred, and it's the end of March. And every time we talk about these things, I always say the canard. When I look at these problems, I wonder how are we as a society contributing to this, and how can we be instrumental in solving it? I think that is the question we need to be asking ourselves, rather than just kind of pretending about solutions and all this type of thing, to really do the hard work. All right. Enough of that. Let's get back to our banking crisis that's not a crisis. I'm going to put on some chapstick real quick. My lips are sticking together. It's, of course, the minute I get on the air. This is not the article I was looking for. Here we go. One of the first things I saw in today's headlines on Bloomberg that I thought was interesting is the brokerage house Charles Schwab is having some liquidity issues. It says here that the company faces pressure from bond losses and rising cash yields. Executives say business is misunderstood and has enough liquidity. Now, it goes on to mention that they have the same problem SVB had, lots of low-yield bonds that are worth very little because interest rates have gone up so much. And they also have a lot of low-yield hold-to-maturity mortgage-backed securities up to $189 billion. And And they are kind of shielding that from dealing with the unrealized losses by moving it around the balance sheet a little bit. And they have kind of made sure that the rest of the business is protected from these bonds going down. But eventually, those losses are going to have to be booked. They're going to have to come due, and it's not going to be pretty for their earnings when they do. There's already suspicion that there's going to be earnings problems for Q1, which we'll start getting reports of in not early April, but like around the 5th or 6th of April. We'll start to get earnings calls and all this type of thing, and that will probably affect stock prices and valuations. It's interesting that such a large brokerage house would be having this issue. The problem is customers at brokerage houses will keep cash in money market accounts in order to make investments or cash out or whatever have you. What banks do in the middle of the night is they sweep all those accounts, lend it overnight to another bank, and then for interest, and then have it all back available for customers in the morning, having made interest on it. And they do this every single night. And so it's very kind of interesting that now customers are shifting away from cash, away from those money market accounts, leaving them less opportunity to make money off of that, kind of amplifying those losses. Now, bearing that in mind, we then turn over to Binance, the crypto exchange, who's now getting sued by the federal government, and Binance is such a much larger, such a larger player in the crypto space over FTX. Like, it is. FTX was not, we'll say, systemically important to the crypto market. Binance is. Without Binance, you don't really have a crypto market. It says here that run by Changpeng CZ Zhao, the world's largest crypto exchange is a dominant force in everything from Bitcoin trading and digital art to venture capital, with its power and influence only increasing after the collapse last year of Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX empire. The inconvenient truth is that Binance has a grip on the $1.1 trillion industry that has few parallels in traditional finance. That's despite all the decentralization talk from crypto's true believers. So the news Monday that the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission, that's the federal government, sued Binance and Chief Executive Officer Zhao for allegedly invading federal laws and operating an illegal digital asset exchange, threatens to send shockwaves across the world of virtual currencies. Bitcoin fell as much as 4.5% after the lawsuit was filed. And then it goes on to get into the details and all this type of thing, and how Binance works and affects the crypto markets and all this type of thing. It says, some crypto fans may well shrug off the charges, yet Binance's many ties to traditional finance may now be at risk. Institutions that have flirted with crypto will have to weigh new charges against the liquidity offered by the world's largest exchange. The CFTC complaint noted that Binance had courted U.S. institutions and directed VIP clients to open Binance accounts via shell companies, which is illegal. Binance ties with traditional banking channels have also recently frayed after Signature Bank, which had been supporting its dollar transactions, went under, and PaySafe, which did the same for trades in the British pounds, stopped service due to regulatory risks. So that is another aspect of our banking crisis that's not a crisis, that we're going towards. The other kind of bit of news about this is First Citizens Bank out of North Carolina over the weekend finished buying the assets of Silicon Valley Bank. Now, what's interesting is that this First Citizens Bank back east is around. It's a fairly large regional bank, but they just basically got a whole lot bigger. It says here, Chairman and CEO Frank Holding Jr. and his four sisters, Olivia Holding, Hope Bryant, Carson Bryce, and Claire Bristow, collectively own 20% of First Citizens stock and have close to 50% voting power in the company, according to SEC filings, for a cumulative stake worth $2.7 billion thanks to Monday's 54% stock gain following the deal. The surge erased all of the stock's year-to-date losses in the regional bank sell-off stemming from SVB's failure and contagion fears. Raleigh-based First Citizens and the Holding family have kept a low profile for decades, but the family-owned bank has been on a mission to expand nationwide via opportunistic acquisitions. Its growth has accelerated since the 2008 financial crisis, thanks in part to a series of more than 20 FDIC-assisted acquisitions of small failed banks, including California's $1.8 billion First Regional Bank, the $1.1 billion Temecula Valley Bank, and also based in Southern California, and $1.8 billion Denver-based United Western Bank. At the end of 2008, First Citizens had assets of $16.7 billion prior to this weekend's SVB deal. The bank's assets stood at $109 billion. So it's kind of interesting. That's a name you're going to want to keep an eye out on in the future for Citizens, because if they're trying to expand and kind of fill in the gap where SVB was, then that's a bank that we might be paying a lot more attention to. And also, here's the other thing, is when you are a bank and you're kind of expanding into a crisis, that also presents an opportunity for failures depending on how well you execute. So it's very important, very, 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 very important, that they don't make any missteps now that they own what's left of Silicon Valley Bank. So, given that they have participated in so many other FDIC arranged takeovers, it's not surprising that the FDIC was so comfortable working with them to deal with the SVB problem. I still want to know why the Federal Reserve didn't give SVB money. That's their job, is to prevent this from happening. If there was a run in progress, why weren't they at the discount window? And that question has never yet been answered by anyone. And I think it's interesting no one's asking that question either. I think that is absolutely fascinating. Anyway, that's all the news we have on our banking crisis that's not a crisis. I want to turn to some other headlines, including a fun one that kind of bounces off our banking crisis situation, has to do with assets. So if you follow Cassandra on Twitter, that is the account of Michael Burry. Michael Burry was made famous in 2008 for predicting the downturn in the housing market and buying options against the housing market, and making a lot of money for his hedge fund. I saw the thread that this article references, so I'll provide some context. His complaint, and I agree with him, is the Federal Reserve has been manipulating asset prices for almost 15 years. So we don't really know what the price of assets actually are when they're not being supported by the Federal Reserve. And his opinion is Jerome Powell should stop talking about assets and interest rates and simply leave the whole system alone. Burry says, quote, Powell should have just said, I don't know, the investor of The Big Short fame tweeted on Saturday. He was likely referring to Fed Chair's comments to reporters after the U.S. Central Bank's policy meeting last week. Quote, and say it again and again as he sits on his hands for the next 6 months, Burry continued. Then we might get some real price discovery. Burry's view appears to be that the Fed's running commentary and policies are distorting financial markets. The Scion asset management boss seems to want Powell and his colleagues to butt out for a while, allowing investors to determine the correct prices for various assets. The Fed cut interest rates to zero and ramped up its bond buying during the pandemic. Its goal was to shore up the economy against sweeping lockdowns, business closures, and supply chain disruptions. Those efforts contributed to historic inflation. Surging prices have spurred the central bank to hike rates north of 4.75% over the past 12 months and begin to shrink its balance sheet. Powell has also been providing frequent updates on the Fed's view of the economy and the actions it expects to take. For example, he said on Wednesday that more hikes may be needed to slow inflation from around 6% to the Fed's target of 2%. He also reassured investors that the banking system is sound. He hinted that federal authorities would make depositors whole if their bank fails, as they did after the recent collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. Powell said, quote, "We have the tools to protect depositors when there's a threat of serious harm to the economy or to the financial system, and we're prepared to use those tools," Powell said. "And I think depositors should assume that their deposits are safe." Stocks, bonds, commodities, cryptocurrencies, and other assets have swung sharply in recent weeks as investors braced for more runs on lenders or even a banking sector meltdown. Powell's comments may have helped assuage those worries, limiting the sale of price declines. So, Burry's point is that asset prices are being manipulated by the Fed, and and he is trying to he's basically would like the federal government to get out of the business of asset price manipulation. I don't blame him for saying that, not at all, because he's right. Like, that is 110% the situation. Asset prices are have been manipulated since the Great Financial Crisis. After the Great Financial Crisis, we chose to save assets over people. That was a decision that Hank Paulson and a bunch of other people made to save assets over people. And since then, that decision has been reinforced by every Fed chair and every Treasury secretary. And so, to some degree, Burry's not wrong. We don't really know what the value of assets and stocks and whatnot really are. We don't really have a read on the economy because the economy is being propped up by the federal government. And the only way to know what the price of things really are, to see where things really are at, would be to be willing to go through the pain of letting assets devalue down to their real prices. The problem, and I think Michael Burry knows this, is the Federal Reserve is never going to let that happen. Because the reality is there's a lot of bad debt in the system. There's a lot of assets that make money, notice the air quotes, that are actually worth zero. That's the dirty little secret. There's a lot of it that's actually worth zero. And there would be hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of basically dead assets, zombie stuff, that's just clogging up the system. And nobody's quite willing to take out the garbage. And nobody's willing to go through the pain of having a flood of sewage to get to a more safe and sane market thereafter. Because the reality is when you let that stuff go, you end up with higher unemployment. People lose their jobs. Businesses close. Businesses can't make payroll. Banks, I mean, it's a mess. No matter how you cut it, it's a mess. But is that mess more or less worth it than continuing to prop up a system that's failing? And I think Michael Burry's point is that we're propping up a system that's failing and this stuff needs to go to zero. And I agree. So that's the latest on our banking crisis. That's not a crisis. Not a crisis, according to Jerome Powell, even though I think it's a crisis. You know. Bouncing off of finances, I want to talk about student loan payments. So as we know, student loan payments will be resuming for all borrowers in June for the first time in 3 years. It's a pandemic era change that's finally coming to an end. And the reality is not paying on student loans has given Americans a lot of extra breathing room cash-wise, and has given people a lot of extra space for spending and consumption, all this type of thing. Well, that's coming to an end. It says here, household budgets are going to face a shock later this year when student loan payments resume. After a 3-year pause in required payments, borrowers with federal loans will soon face monthly bills again. That presents risks similar to the effects of the 2013 fiscal cliff when tax increases led to reduced consumer spending. Jefferies money market economist Tom Simmons wrote in a note. It's very likely that most households that were previously making student loan payments have not been saving the extra money or including the payments in their budgets, he wrote. Households still have roughly half of the excess savings from the pandemic sitting on their balance sheets, but there's less cushion to absorb a substantial increase in outlays. The student loan restart date hinges on legal challenges to President Joe Biden's forgiveness plan. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments last month in 2 cases challenging the program, which would forgive up to $20,000 in federal loans per borrower. Payments are set to resume 60 days after the Supreme Court issues its opinion, or June 30th, whichever comes first. That puts the restart date at no later than August the 29th, and the first monthly installment would be due by the end of September. An additional lawsuit brought by private lender SoFi against the Department of Education is attempting to overturn the current payment freeze on the basis that its 0% interest rate is harming SoFi's reservicing business. The average monthly student loan payment prior to the pandemic was $393, according to the Federal Reserve. Collectively, those payments translate to about 0.06% to about 0.6% of personal income and 0.8% of monthly personal consumption expenditures, according to Jeffries. That's similar to the impact of the tax increases associated with the fiscal cliff, which was followed by a noticeable slowdown in consumption. And although the delinquency rates on debt are still below pre-pandemic levels, the student loan moratorium could be skewing the measurement, since households haven't yet been burdened by that monthly bill. Without the pause, those delinquencies would almost certainly be higher by now. I do not think that the Supreme Court is going to allow the student loan forgiveness to go through. I think they're probably going to strike it down. Even though it's based on the legalities of a Bush-era law, they did it without direct congressional authorization. And my guess is there's going to, Thomas and Roberts are going to be going, herder, my Constitution, and finance bills must start in the House and blah, 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 blah. And so I think that's going to kill off the forgiveness program, and we're going to get payments starting back up in earnest, which is going to have an adverse effect on the economy. It may be the thing that tips us into recession later this year. We've been in a technical recession for a hot minute. However, a big drawdown in consumption and that money flowing out of the economy and into the federal government, which will help inflation, actually, will definitely have an effect on consumption. On the bright side, it will draw down inflation because it will suck money out of the economy. It's basically a quiet tax for people that chose to go to college, and so it will suck money out of the economy. It will particularly suck money out of wealthy households. Now, here's where I think it's a disadvantage, and here's why I'm sad that forgiveness isn't going to go through. The forgiveness at $10,000 to $20,000 would unburden the group of people who went to college, tried college out, didn't graduate. So they have the debt, no degree. A lot of those people owe around like 8 to 10 grand sort of thing. So we're not helping doctors. Okay. We're not helping people like me that are overeducated. I'm on the hook for a lot more than $20,000. So let's just bear that in mind. But for those that didn't finish and had some debt and have kind of been stuck with this like albatross of debt, it would actionably help them, working people. Do I think the Supreme Court's going to allow it to go through? No. Do I think student loan payments are going to restart? Possibly. The Biden administration may decide to extend that, but then again, it may not, and it may just let that pandemic era economic help finally resolve itself and let the payments and the student loan issues resume. I think to the point of the article, though, we are going to have a precipitous rise in defaults. I think there's going to be a lot of people looking for some sort of relief or repackaging or something. I think at this point, for debt of a certain age, it would probably behoove some of these servicers and the federal government to come to some conclusion about dealing with this debt. That's the problem with student loan debt, is that you can't get rid of it. Even after, a set time of years and all this type of thing, you're just stuck with it forever and ever and ever, and you can never get rid of it. And it's difficult. It's difficult. While we're talking about courts, I want to talk about the Internet Archive. So the Internet Archive has lost a historic copyright case and vows to appeal. It was sued for lifting lending limits on ebooks it had scanned itself. This is from Vice. And it says here that the Internet Archive has pledged to appeal a judge's decision in a landmark copyright case brought against it by major publishers. In the case, the judge determined that the Internet Archive is liable for copyright infringement for a book lending library that became popular during the early stages of COVID-19. Quick drink. 3 years ago, the Internet Archive lifted one-to-one lending limits for 3.6 million books to help countless teachers and students access materials that no one expected would become suddenly unavailable because of widespread COVID-19 lockdowns. This prompted 4 of the largest book publishers in the world to retaliate, suing the Internet Archive for copyright infringement. Now, I think it is interesting in this whole process, I won't read the whole thing, is that I think this is going to cause a complete sort of re-evaluation of how we deal with copyright in digital spaces and how we deal with the distribution of information and who controls that and who monetizes that. Now, let's remember that because I'm going to get to Chat GPT here in a second. Because Chat GPT 4 came out this weekend. And so that, I think this case is going to cause us to re-look at all of that. However, I also fear that this also may be the end of things like the Internet Archive and the end of the preservation of digital data independent of the people that own it. So, much like how in the old print days, you would have limited print runs for books, and oftentimes, you know, the longer you got out from the book's publishing date, the fewer and fewer copies there were of it. They got burnt by fire, they were eventually recycled, they were eventually thrown out. And so libraries and used bookstores became these sorts of repositories of books and knowledge that obviously was no longer being printed. The publisher may have gone out of business depending on how many years it was. And in the digital space, it is easier to preserve things, but rather than having a decentralized system like we had in the print days where it was libraries, independent bookstores, thrift stores, people's homes, in the digital space, these companies want to control what they have out there at any given time. So if a company decides in their giant catalog of books that they don't want to have certain things available in a digital format and it's only on paper or only on their service or all this type of thing, they would have the control to do that. And I think that's what we're moving towards, is a system where these companies, which are all giant, overpaid, bloated, billion-dollar corporations, hashtag support independent authors, like me, CameronJournal.com, are going to be able to have outsized control on who's retaining digital data, who's lending it around, where it can exist. And that's not good, because the reality is if any of these companies go down, if any of these companies, their catalog becomes, for whatever reason, unavailable, as we've seen in television streaming with things like HBO Max, where they don't just quit making the show, they take it off the service so they don't have to pay people. If book publishers start doing the same thing, then it makes less information available, when the internet was supposed to make information more available, not less. And that is the true danger of this Internet Archives lawsuit. Some people have said it may be the end of the Internet Archive, and that would be truly sad, because a lot of stuff on the internet ends up getting lost. It's happened to me several times where I have written stuff for sites, I've written stuff for different people, whatever have you, and it is disappeared because the site went under, they went out of business, all this type of thing. And so sometimes the only way you can get a hold of stuff is if it has been archived somewhere else, or it's in the Wayback Machine, or all this type of thing. And so it all becomes very difficult. And I think that's quite sad and quite unfortunate. But unfortunately, I think the publishers are going to win this one out, because they always tend to. They have a very nasty habit of doing that. So, bouncing off of that, we're going to talk about Chat GPT. This is an interesting article from Bloomberg. It says here, nearly half of firms are drafting policies on Chat GPT use. It says here nearly half of human resource leaders polled by consulting firm Gartner said they're in the process of formulating guidance on employees' use of OpenAI's artificial intelligence chatbot, Chat GPT. What those policies will look like may end up varying widely. Some Wall Street firms, like Bank of America and Goldman Sachs, have banned the chatbot, while hedge fund giant Citadel has embraced it. At the same time, 1/3 of HR leaders surveyed by Gartner said they aren't planning to issue any policies on employees' use of ChatGPT, even as experts raise concerns about copyright infringement and data privacy and caution users against the chatbot's tendency to, at times, simply make stuff up. Already, over 40% of professionals polled by Fishbowl, a social platform owned by an employer review site Glassdoor, have used ChatGPT at work. Software developers, consultants, and bankers are among the early adopters who've used the tool to write emails, reports, and bits of code. Most went rogue, according to the Fishbowl survey, experimenting with the tool without telling their bosses. Wall Street firms have started to crack down. Alongside Bank of America and Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank AG, and Wells Fargo have banned the use of ChatGPT, but they're in the minority. So far, only 3% of HR leaders surveyed by Gartner said they've banned ChatGPT for any business purpose. Others, like Citadel, are taking the opposite tack, negotiating an enterprise-wide license for the tool. This branch of technology has real impact on our business, Ken Griffin, its billionaire founder, told Bloomberg. Everything from helping our developers write better code to translating software between languages to analyze various types of information that we analyze in the ordinary course of our business. Meanwhile, Microsoft debuted its revamped suite of Office applications on Thursday, integrating OpenAI's new ChatGPT-4 AI model into Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and Word. The software is currently being tested with 20 companies, including 8 in the Fortune 500, that Microsoft declined to name. Obviously, we're entering in a new age with all of this. I think ultimately companies will start to embrace this stuff, but it's probably going to be under their control. Not many companies want all of their business kind of out in the public like that. We don't really know where the information goes, or how it, how it's stored, how it's retained, all this type of thing. If it's learning based upon proprietary things, you wouldn't necessarily want anybody to know. But I think in time, companies will want to embrace these AI tools, because here's the reality: if they don't embrace AI, their competitors will, and if their competitors start to make money thanks to AI, they're all going to be forced to begin to incorporate AI and ChatGPT and large language models into their business. Now, we still have the situation where we don't know how we're going to solve the issue that these AI and language models are trained on data that OpenAI does not pay for, and is being trained on information that they don't, isn't, the bot does not cite its work, and so we don't know where the information comes from, hence the simply making stuff up problem. But these are all very difficult problems to solve with ChatGPT. I am surprised at the corporate resistance to it, but like I said, I think it's going to be something where resistance today, embrace tomorrow. So we're coming up to the end of the show, because I do about 45 minutes. But I want to dash through a couple things. One, if you're flying this summer, watch out. The FAA is warning flights of a 45% increase in flight delays this summer in New York City and DC as it deals with a staff shortage. The FAA anticipates a 45% increase in flight delays at East Coast airports in the summer of 2023. The agency is blaming a post-pandemic shortage of air traffic controllers at key New York facilities. Airlines will be temporarily allowed to give up slots and times at airports in New York and DC. So if you're planning on flying this summer, much like last summer, watch out. It's probably going to get a little complicated. Also, on that note, speaking of travel and all this type of thing, if you saw the picture of Pope Francis in the huge white papal puffer jacket with a huge white cross, looking fly as all hell, like he's about to go to One Oak in LA, you were duped. That image is not actually the Pope. It was an image created by Midjourney AI. I probably should have said this. I tried to do the story after Chat GPT. Oh well. I fell for it. It looks very real, I must say. It looks surprisingly real. It doesn't look fake or drawn by AI at all. Like, the fabric looks right, like, the lighting is good. Someone pointed out his skin is kind of wrong, which, like, once someone mentions it, I can kind of see it. And someone mentioned that, like, the ears are kind of off and all this type of things. Like, once I can kind of, like, once people point out things that look funny, I can kind of see it, sort of thing. But, that picture went viral over the weekend, and His Excellency, His Holiness, has spoken out. He says here, quote, are our national and international institutions able to hold technology companies accountable for the social and cultural impact of their products, Francis said. Is there a risk that increased inequality could undermine our sense of human and social solidarity? Could we lose our sense of having a shared destiny? The Pope's comments came after an AI image of Francis was originally posted on Reddit and later gained thousands of views and likes on Twitter, showing the head of the Catholic Church in a white puffer coat and a jeweled crucifix while holding a coffee mug. Many on social media were initially fooled by the photos, including me, which were later determined to be fake, sparking conversations about the dangers of AI being used to fake someone's identity, according to The New Scientist. Francis's recent remarks were not his first comments on the potential risks of rapidly changing and evolving technology, as he said in 2020 that Catholics should pray that AI and technology remain under human control, according to the Catholic news agencies. Despite his concerns, the Pope indicated on Monday that he has a hopeful outlook on the future of technology and warned against dismissing its potential uses. Quote, from this perspective, Francis said, I am convinced that the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning has the potential to contribute in a positive way to the future of humanity. We cannot dismiss it. The Vatican did not immediately respond to the Daily Caller's News Foundation's request for comment. That was in the Daily Caller. The last story I want to do, I have an article about industrial policy, but we might save that for next week because it gets into production and all this type of thing, and we don't really have time for that right now. I have to save that one for later. But the final story we have is on Zoom towns and how people who moved to remote locations while working remotely are facing layoffs and figuring out they might have to move back from whence they came because there are no jobs where they moved. It says here, people relocated to smaller cities in search of lower costs and a better quality of life. Job cuts are pushing them in unexpected directions. Says here, before he was laid off by Amazon, Jesse Lindsay was making more money than he'd ever had in his life working from home in Bozeman, Montana. After losing his job, the 39-year-old father and Navy veteran found himself stacking boxes at the local Lowe's. It wasn't the life he pictured when he moved with his family last summer, giving up a peripatetic Navy life to take a fully remote job as a technical recruiter in the mountain town. Amazon's decision to eliminate tens of thousands of jobs, part of the wave of hundreds of thousands of cuts at firms across the U.S. this year, is forcing remote workers like Lindsay to make hard choices. Leave or stay? Hold out for another highly paid remote gig or shift to a local job with a lower wage? These are the questions facing transplants in so-called Zoom towns, dubbed that because of the prevalence of remote workers spending their days on video calls. They are places like Bozeman, Bloomington, Moab, and Missoula, beautiful but far from the country's traditional tech and finance hubs. They boomed during the pandemic, offering remote knowledge workers small-town charms and a chance to make their big city paychecks go far. Now, 3 years after the COVID-era working model began to take shape, new economic realities are challenging it, sending its beneficiaries into uncharted territory once again. And the article goes on to talk about people moving in and their incomes and buying houses and forcing up housing prices and all this type of thing. I always wondered what was going to happen with that. And now we have the answer. I was like, well, what if you need to change jobs and if companies are really embracing remote work that much? And I've always struggled, when I worked to get a remote position going. That was before the pandemic, of course, and all this type of thing. But it seems like, there are some companies that are okay with remote work and others that are totally rejecting it. And so I worry that, if you're wanting to work remotely in a certain industry and you're not living where that industry is, it would be incredibly difficult, nay impossible, to get a different remote job if you got laid off or had to change jobs or was unhappy, all this everything. And I always wondered what would come of that. Like, what does someone who's working in tech in Bozeman do? And apparently it's stack boxes at Lowe's, which is unfortunate. I mean, it's probably a huge pay cut and it's impacted his family and all this type of thing. But that just always seems unwise. In a fluid employment environment, you want to have options, because there's no loyalty, hasn't been for decades. And there's no assurance that your job's going to continue into the future. Instability is a thing, and we live in unstable times. And I wonder how many of those people are going to end up losing a lot of money on a lot of very fancy homes and condos in exotic locations because they have to move back to where the work is. That being said, though, I think one of the great terrible things about what has happened in this country over the last 15 years or so is how much of the economic growth has been concentrated in a handful of superstar cities and hasn't really spread out to the rest of the country. After World War II, when the factories left the cities and moved out to the suburbs, that really broadened the economic base of the country into a lot of places that hadn't really seen economic growth before. And so that kind of raised a lot of boats. We've done a lot of growth in the 21st century over the last 20 years, and a lot of great things have happened. But if you don't live in Seattle, San Francisco, LA, New York, Denver, Dallas, Houston, Miami, that probably hasn't reached you. It doesn't even reach much farther outside of the metro areas of those cities. And so you've seen mass urbanization, people moving to cities to find better jobs, find better lives, all this type of thing. And it's caused a terrible housing crunch and a traffic crunch and all other types of crunches. And the pandemic seemed to give a way to kind of undo that and move that growth outward. But this article would have us believe that apparently not everything that glitters is gold when it comes to remote work and trying to find remote positions that allow you to live in lower cost, charming places and not live near to where companies and jobs are. So I do think, though, very strongly that companies who embrace remote work are going to win because it gives you the entire country and in some cases the world to pull talent from. And that means that rather than waiting for the people to move to you, you can go to the people. If you can find someone who's brilliant at what you do and they happen to live in Crested Butte or Missoula or Moab or whatever have you, that's a quite different talent advantage you have over companies that are really stuck to a local geographic area. Now, obviously, in places like New York, that is much more muted because there's 15 million people in the tri-state area. But if you're here in Seattle, that's a different story. If you're in Denver, that's a different story. If you're even in San Francisco, where the cost of living is prohibitive for talent to move to you, it can make a lot of sense to look farther out. And that's why I think the companies that embrace remote work and give people a chance to have some flexibility in their working lives are the ones that are going to win. So that's the news this week. Today's March 27th, 2023. My name is Cameron Lee Cowan. This has been the Cameron Journal News Hour. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you for watching. And we will see you next week. Catch me online at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, Cameron L. Cowan on Facebook, and Cameron Cowan on Instagram. Thank you guys so much. Talk soon. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com.
We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal Podcast.